Welcome to the Working Globally webinar on cultural dimensions. This is part 2 of Module 2 in Working Globally's Intercultural Competency series. If you have ever traveled abroad or worked with colleagues from other cultures, I'm sure you've noticed that they don't always do things the way you would do them, and they don't always act as you expect them to or wish they would. Your colleagues may make decisions differently. They may interact with their managers differently. They may not always do what they seem to say they will. This module explains the beliefs that underpin these different behaviors and discusses how these differences in beliefs often affect the way individuals conduct their business activities. Module 1 described the meaning of intercultural competency and presented a framework for becoming interculturally competent. This module presents much of the general knowledge upon which the remaining layers of the intercultural competency framework are built. In this module, I will identify and describe the 6 remaining characteristics of cultures, which we call cultural dimensions. Understanding these cultural dimensions is essential for becoming interculturally competent. In our on-site workshops, I will assume you understand each of the 11 cultural dimensions covered in Part 1 and Part 2 of this module. They will become our common vocabulary for discussing the challenges you will face and the techniques for overcoming these challenges. For this reason, if as you go through this, you have any questions, send me an email. Let's try to resolve these issues before we get together in the workshops. Anyone who has more than one demand on their time, which is most of us, has to decide what to work on at any given instant. We call this decision prioritization. By deciding to work on task A and not on task B, we implicitly give task A a higher priority than task B. Fixed versus variable priority is a measure of how frequently we readjust priorities, the types of things that cause us to readjust priorities, the process we use to readjust priorities, and the manner in which we notify others that our priorities have changed. This description makes it sound as if considerable effort goes into adjusting priorities, and in some cultures, considerable effort does go into adjusting priorities. For the most part, however, these decisions occur by reflex and often in less than a second. People with a fixed priority orientation minimize readjustments. They do this by limiting the types of things that would cause them to make readjustments and by making the process complex and cumbersome. For example, everyone who would be directly affected by the readjustment has to agree to the change. In addition, everyone directly and indirectly affected by the readjustment must be notified of the change. Cultures with a fixed priority orientation tend to believe that the most efficient way to get things done is to plan, that is, schedule your time, especially the time you will interact with others. Once the plan is done, it is closely followed. Fixed priority people believe making people wait is inefficient and should be avoided at all costs. Fixed priority people also tend to set daily goals for themselves and hope to meet or exceed these goals within the normal workday. People with a variable priority orientation believe that conditions are constantly changing, and as a result, the most effective way to get things done is to constantly reassess priorities and change them whenever the need arises. Almost anything may cause a priority readjustment. For example, being given a task with an immediate deadline, or getting a request from someone with a stronger relationship connection than the requester of the current high priority task. Requests from family or close friends almost always result in reprioritization. Further, notification of parties who will be directly or indirectly impacted by the changed priority is not required. If the people who are impacted are from the same culture, they will understand. Similar to fixed priority individuals, variable priority individuals may, though not always, set daily goals for themselves. But when such goals are set, people from these variable priority cultures have no expectation that the goals will be met within the normal workday. Many years ago, when I was traveling across India with some Indian friends, my friends told me if I wanted to enjoy the trip, I must adopt the Indian perspective. Each morning, I needed to start the day with no expectation about where I would be at day's end. If I set expectations, they told me, each day would be frustrating and a disappointment. They told me if I concentrated on experiencing the trip and not worrying about reaching a destination, then and only then would I enjoy India. It is no surprise that Indians believe in the value of variable priorities. When cultures valuing fixed priority and cultures valuing variable priority attempt to work together, the likelihood that trust will be lost is very high. Feelings of disrespect and confusion about levels of interest and levels of dedication often arise during planning, scheduling, execution, and monitoring activities. In our workshops, we will go into more detail about why this often occurs and what can be done to prevent this loss of trust. When we have many things to work on, in addition to deciding what to work on, we need to decide on the most efficient way to work on these things. In particular, should we work on tasks to completion before beginning other tasks, or should we jump back and forth from task to task, depending on our mood, our inspiration, or some other ad hoc event? Monochrons believe it is most efficient to complete one task before starting another. Polychrons believe it is most efficient to jump from task to task, depending on ad hoc events. Monochronic or polychronic belief underpins our choice of how we like to work. In this case, it is not a belief about the best way to prioritize work. It is a belief about the best way to allocate the limited amount of time we have to work. Are we more efficient focusing on single tasks until they are complete, or jumping from task to task, moving several towards completion at the same time, but with no predictable allocation of effort? Are projects and day-to-day operational activities more likely to be completed satisfactorily if we break them into small steps and closely monitor the completion of each step, or if we let everyone work at their own pace and in their own way? For a monochron, switching back and forth from one activity to another is not only wasteful and distracting, it is uncomfortable. Monochrons love to plan in detail, making lists, keeping track of their activities, organizing their time into daily routines, and they are motivated by schedules with deadlines. Polychrons are the opposite. Although polychrons can meet deadlines, they need to do so in their own way. A polychron does not want detailed plans imposed upon him, nor does he want to make his own detailed plans. Polychrons prefer to work as they see fit, without a strict schedule, following their own internal mental processes from one minute to the next. Rather than feel uncomfortable switching back and forth between activities as monochrons do, polychrons feel switching from one activity to another is both stimulating and productive, and hence the most desirable way to work. For a polychron, exact times and even exact dates are not really meaningful, and hence are not all that important, while a monochron makes times and dates the focus and master of each day. Not surprisingly, there is a correlation between variable priority cultures and polychronic cultures, and fixed priority and monochronic cultures. Think of how much easier it is to reprioritize if you believe your schedule is just a preliminary estimate. It's much more difficult to reprioritize when you believe the schedule is fixed and must be obeyed. Since polychrons believe their daily calendar is only a preliminary description of their daily activities, subject to unplanned future events, polychrons have no problem making time for the ad hoc demands of those with whom they have strong relationships. Activities where polychrons and monochrons have difficulty working together include planning, scheduling, monitoring, deciding on how and when to organize things, and how to conduct meetings. Everyone needs to devote some part of their life producing wealth, because wealth is needed for shelter, for food, medicine, education, etc. But what is the best way for a community to generate wealth? Should each member work just hard enough to generate the amount of wealth they feel they need and want? Or should each member work as hard as they can for the benefit of the entire community, with the community then providing everyone with adequate goods and services? Individualists believe that both individuals and society, that is, everyone else, benefit the most when each person is encouraged to accomplish the most they can as individuals. This means individuals are responsible for their health, wealth, and safety. They do not expect others to provide or care for them, nor do they want to provide or care for others. But by focusing on increasing their own wealth and well-being, unintentionally, the wealth of the group is maximized. At least that's what individualists believe. Collectivists believe that both individuals and society benefit the most when each person is encouraged to work for the good of all. This works because the group or society is expected to meet every individual's needs, for example, healthcare, housing, and education. When everyone works for the good of the group, collectivists believe the wealth of the group will be maximized. If people work only for themselves, some may become very wealthy, but the wealth of all, taken together, will be less. That's what collectivists believe. People who believe that individualism creates the most wealth prefer to work on their own. They like to be personally responsible and accountable for the work they do. They like to be rewarded when their work is good and accept the consequences when they fail to meet expectations. They expect to be empowered to make decisions on their own. People who believe collectivism creates the most wealth prefer to work as part of a group where they expect each member of the group to work to their ability, but to be judged by the group's performance. Because the group's, not an individual's, performance is judged, decisions are made only after consensus or complete agreement is reached. The group as a whole is responsible and accountable for work done, not individuals. Individualists do things that will promote their own self-interest. Collectivists do things that will promote the good of their group, which may be their company or their department within the company. It should be noted that individualists can work effectively as team members. Individualists recognize that in some cases teamwork is needed to get things done. Nevertheless, even when working as part of a team, individualists expect their individual contributions to be recognized and rewarded. Individualist cultures reward and encourage uniqueness. A saying associated with individualist cultures is that the squeaky wheel gets the oil. What is meant by this is that those who won't take no for an answer usually get rewarded because they are the individuals who get things done. Collectivist cultures punish and discourage uniqueness. A saying associated with collectivist cultures is that the nail that stands out gets hammered down. What is meant by this is that group members who fail to go along with the group put the group in danger. So every member of the group is responsible for making sure every other member of the group behaves. Persons from collectivist cultures define themselves as part of a group. Hence, when asked to describe themselves, they will often describe their role within their group, not their own uniqueness. Group membership is part of the identity of collectivists. Without such membership, part of their identity is lost. An individualist's identity is independent of any group they may be members of. Because of these different beliefs, collectivists and individualists will conduct themselves differently in meetings and during planning sessions. They will have different expectations about who makes decisions and how decisions should be made, and they will have different expectations concerning who should be rewarded and what types of behaviors should be rewarded. And as noted earlier, there is a correlation between individualism and direct communication and collectivism and indirect communication. As we go through these descriptions of culture-based behaviors, keep in mind that culture is not the only thing that can be used to predict how individuals will react and behave. For example, studies have shown that the members of different professions often exhibit average beliefs that differ from the average beliefs of the regional culture. And also, companies can develop their own company culture, which may differ, at least in some ways, from the regional culture. Within the deductive versus inductive belief range, professions are often as important as regional culture. As an example, let's consider technical operations versus consultants and architects. One of the biggest challenges facing technical operations staff and consultants and architects is that they view the world, the challenges facing an organization, and the process of problem solving differently. Technical operations staff tend to be inductive, while consultants and architects tend to be deductive. Technical operations staff is always dealing with specific and immediate problems. Each problem solved is a win. The longer problems remain unsolved, the greater the perceived failure. Usually, staff is in constant firefighting mode with a backlog of unsolved problems. Not surprisingly, technical operations staff is focused on details. Consultants and architects, on the other hand, seldom deal with specific and immediate problems. Their challenge is to look over the big picture and to design processes that will hopefully reduce the amount of specific and immediate problems, as well as enable specific and immediate problems to be quickly resolved. If the consultant and architects do a good job, the backlog of unsolved problems will be kept small. One would expect that technical operations staff and consultants and architects would work well together. that their strengths and areas of expertise would be complementary. But instead, these two disciplines have been irritating and exasperating one another for the entire technological age. The reason for this inability to work together is that each side is convinced that the other side is approaching the problem from the wrong direction. Consultants and architects approach the problem by first defining goals and high-level objectives, and then request data from the operations staff to help them understand how these goals and objectives are affected by current operating processes. Consultants and architects are looking for generic root causes, which, when corrected, will hopefully resolve many types of specific root causes. They are using a deductive approach to solve the problem. Operations staff often think this approach is crazy. How, they ask, can you even decide on appropriate goals until you have analyzed the current detailed data? Operations staff approach the problem by analyzing the details, understanding what is needed to solve each of the problems they face. Only after all the data has been analyzed do operations staff attempt to set goals and high-level objectives. And these are almost always in a form that would correct the particular problems they have analyzed. They are using an inductive approach to solve the problems. Consultants and architects usually think this approach is crazy. Why, they ask, would you want to spend time analyzing data when without goals and high-level objectives, you don't even know what data is important and what is not? Different cultures are like consultants and operations staff. Some cultures believe the deductive approach is the best way to plan, set priorities, and solve problems. People from these cultures are always asking why. They need to understand why something should be done before they can even start to think about what should be done or how to do it. Other cultures believe the inductive approach is the best way to plan, set priorities, and solve problems. People from these cultures are always asking how. How can we fix it? How can we do it? They do not need to consider the broader consequences of the fix. Only after a fix has been proposed do inductive people explore the larger possible consequences of the fix. It is surprising how many big and small projects never get off the ground because colleagues can't decide on how to begin. Some years ago, I went to India to learn from the Indian perspective what it is like working with non-Indians. I conducted many interviews and amassed a large amount of data which represented the Indian perspective. A few years later, a colleague asked if I would be interested in co-authoring a paper based on this data. The project was intriguing and we started to plan the effort. I'm a U.S. American, and my colleague was Austrian. Immediately, we started to argue. My colleague felt we should start by analyzing the data, and I felt we should start by using what we knew about Indians and other cultures to structure the way we would analyze the data. Sound familiar? We were starting to think perhaps we could not work together. Then I started to laugh. What's so funny, she said, sounding exasperated. You are being so Austrian, and I am being so American, I said, because Austrians tend to be inductive and U.S. Americans tend to be deductive. Let's do it this way, I suggested. You start analyzing the data, and I will work on a statement of the research goals and objectives, and we'll see if we meet in the middle. Our collaboration proved successful, and the paper was published. These two opposite beliefs will affect how meetings should be run, how to approach issues under arbitration, how to influence people, how to plan, and communication protocols. The cultural dimension called reciprocity has two attributes. The first attribute is the belief that relationships are strengthened by the practice of exchanging favors and by showing appropriate respect. Often, this respect is shown by agreeing or at least keeping silent or not disagreeing. The second attribute is that unwritten records are kept. That is, people keep a continuous mental balance sheet where favors and disrespect are remembered and repaid. In low reciprocity cultures, if a person helps another, there is no belief that the other now owes a favor in return. And if a person acts in a manner that might be interpreted as disrespectful, for example, strongly disagreeing with you in a meeting or pointing out in public that you were not appropriately prepared or that you made a mistake, the memory of this would quickly be forgotten and would not affect how the two of you work together in the future. Expectations and consequences are very different in high reciprocity cultures. In high reciprocity cultures, if someone has helped you, you are expected to help them when requested. As long as you owe the debt must be repaid when the request is made. Declining to help for any reason may terminate the relationship. At the very least, it will damage the relationship. And memories in high reciprocity cultures last a very long time. The same goes for actions that can be interpreted as disrespectful. Actions of disrespect will be punished, may terminate relationships, and will be remembered for a long time. If you are working in a high reciprocity culture and you humiliate a colleague in public by pointing out, for example, that they made a mistake, you may find that colleague is no longer willing to work with you. Impersonal, equality, and low context cultures usually are low reciprocity cultures, while relational, high power distance, and high context cultures usually are high reciprocity cultures. Where a culture lies in the low to high reciprocity range will affect how meetings are run, how to approach issues under arbitration, how to influence people, and communication protocols such as being direct or indirect. The last cultural dimension we will discuss relates to how people believe they should convey information. Some cultures believe the best way to convey information is to use as few words as possible, with each thought clearly connected to the preceding thought and with the short communication making a clear and unambiguous point. This is called a linear speech pattern. Some cultures believe the best way to convey information is to include an occasional sidebar to what would otherwise be a linear pattern. We will call this a digressive speech pattern. Still, other cultures believe it is improper, even a bit disrespectful, to make a clear and unambiguous point. In these cultures, people believe the best way to convey information is to describe the context of the situation and let the listener draw their own conclusion. We will call this a holistic speech pattern. Holistic speakers usually take much longer to answer questions than linear speakers. They often feel linear speakers are arrogant and simplistic, while linear speakers often feel holistic speakers are confusing and never seem to get to the point. Perhaps some examples will make it easier to understand these differences. Let's say you ask a linear speaker if they enjoyed their recent trip to Italy. At the most extreme, you might simply get yes as an answer. A holistic speaker answering the same question might say, "When I visited Italy, the food was very interesting. I found the wine to be better than German wines. When I would walk through the towns after dinner, the air was full of music, but the smell of garbage seemed to be everywhere. The shops were full of such beautiful things, but the lines were so long." The answer would go on and on like this, and in the end, you still might not be sure if they liked visiting Italy. A digressive speaker answering the same question might say, "In general, I liked visiting Italy. The food was nice. The food reminded me of a time I was in Spain and the restaurants were all filled with a wonderful garlic aroma. When I was in Spain, I loved to eat tapas. So, yes, I would say I very much liked visiting Italy." Digressive and holistic speakers can test the patience of linear speakers, but the consequences of these differences can be much worse than just a feeling of impatience. When, for example, linear and holistic speakers attempt to communicate, the communication may fail completely. This is because the linear speaker only listens to the spoken words and does not continuously ask themselves, how should I be interpreting these words? A holistic speaker, when asked how things are going, might say, "Well, person A was out sick last week, and person B was put on a new task, and the meeting with Department X was postponed." All very interesting descriptions of the week's events, but what the holistic speaker was trying to communicate, the really important thing that happened during the week, and which the linear speaker may have completely missed, is that task alpha is now 2 weeks late. During our workshops, we will talk more about these differences, how to recognize them, and techniques for ensuring that communications are successful. In Module 2 of Working Globally's Intercultural Competency Series, we have tried to give you all the foundational information you need to appreciate how culture affects workplace behaviors and to begin to understand the important belief differences that cause these differences in behaviors. We've covered a lot of material, so you may want to watch the module again to be sure you remember the terminology. In the workshops, we will use this terminology as we identify and discuss the many behaviors that are considered appropriate by different people from different parts of the world.